Hey, I'm sitting in front of my coin jars that we keep for, paying for meters downtown, and my wallet, which is mostly full of receipts, not much cash in there, and wanted to record this story about tithing that I read in Blue Like Jazz. So just listen. Maybe it will help you just with some perspective on tithing. I just thought it was really a helpful story for me. So it's Donald Miller, and he's writing about the story of tithing. He says, one of my good friends, Kurt Heidschmidt, gave a lecture about tithing not very long ago. It was strange to get a lecture about tithing from Kurt because Kurt is not even a church sort of guy. He goes and all, but he hates it. Usually people who go to church and hate it aren't going around giving lectures about tithing, but Kurt gave me a pretty good talking to. Kurt works at a cabinet shop and cusses all the time and tells dirty jokes, but he tithes, sort of. He used to keep a huge jar in his dresser that was full of money, and when he deposited his paychecks, he would pull out 10% from the bank, cold, hard cash. He would take the money home and put it in that jar. The thing must have had a couple $1,000s in it. I was over one night watching South Park, and Kurt was griping because the cabinet shop didn't pay him enough so he could get the motorcycle he wanted. Well, I told him, you must have thousands of dollars in that stinking jar, Kurt. Use that. This was before I knew it was his tithing money. Can't. Why? Can't. Why? It isn't mine, Miller. Kurt leaned back in his recliner and looked at me over the top of his beer can. Isn't yours, I asked. Who in the world is storing their savings on your dresser? I pointed toward his bedroom. Well, he smiled, sort of embarrassed. It's God's. God's, I shouted. Yeah, that's my tithe. I was a little shocked, to be honest. Like I said before, he didn't seem like the tithing type. I don't even think he went to church 9 out of 10 Sundays, but when he did, he just grumbled about it. Well, why don't you take it down to the church and give it to them, I asked. I haven't been to church in a while, that's why. Kurt, I told him, you are the most interesting person I know. Thank you, Don. You want a beer? Yes. Kurt went over to the fridge and opened a couple of Henrys. You tithe, Don? I just looked at him. I couldn't believe it. I was about to get a lecture on tithing from a guy who probably subscribes to Bikes and Babes magazine. Well, Kurt, I guess I don't. After I said this, Kurt shook his head in disappointment. I started feeling really guilty. It's a shame, Don. Kurt tilted back a bottle as he spoke, punctuating the sentence with a post-swig burp. You are missing out. I've been tithing since I was a kid. Wouldn't miss a payment to save my life. Am I dreaming this? I asked him. Dreaming what? This conversation, I said. I said this as I was pointing back and forth between he and I. Don, let me tell you, you should be tithing. That is not your money. That is God's money. You ought to be ashamed of yourself stealing from God and all. You write Christian books and everything, and you're not even giving God's money back to him. Well, you don't have to go making me feel bad about it. You haven't exactly given your money to God either. It's right there on your dresser. Kurt leaned over the big arm of his recliner and with a Jack Nicholson grin on his face said, Oh, don't you worry about that, big boy. That's God's money, and he's going to get it. I've never stolen a dime from God, and I'm never going to start. Honestly, I couldn't believe this was happening to me. I go over to Kurt's house to watch South Park, and I get a guilt trip from this fundamentalist. Kurt went down about 2 weeks later and turned all his money into the church secretary, more than $3,000. I started feeling so guilty I couldn't sleep. I met with Rick, that's his pastor, after that, and I confessed to my pastor that I was not giving any money to Imago Dei, that's his church. Rick had come over to the house, and we were lying about how much we could bench press, and then I just blurted out, I'm not giving any money to the church, Rick, not a dime. Okay, he said. Interesting way to change the conversation. Why, he asked. Why aren't you giving any money to the church? Because I don't have any money. Everything goes to rent and groceries. That sounds like a tough situation, he said, very compassionately. So am I exempt, I asked. Nope, he said. We want your cash. How much, I asked. How much do you make? I don't know. About $1,000 a month, maybe. Then we want 100. And you should also know how much you make. Part of the benefit of giving a portion of your money is it makes you think about where your money goes. God does not want us to be sloppy with our finances, Don. But I need money for rent. You also need to trust God. I know. I just think it would be easier to trust God if I had extra money to trust him with. That would not be faith then, would it? No. Well, bud, I just want you to know I hate this part of the job because it sounds like I am asking for your money. I don't care whether or not we have your money. Our needs are met. I want to tell you that you are missing out on so much, Don. So much what? The fruit of obedience, he said, looking very pastoral. When we do what God wants us to do, we are blessed. We are spiritually healthy. God wants us to give a portion of our money to his work on earth. By setting aside money from every check, you are trusting God to provide. He wants you to get over that fear, the fear of trusting him. It's a scary place, but that is where you have to go as a follower of Christ. There are times when my wife and I don't have enough money to cover bills, but we know the first bill, the first payment we make is to the church. That is most important. If the other bills get neglected, then we need to watch how we are spending money. And there are times when we have found ourselves in that situation, but it works out. We're getting good at trusting God, and we're getting good at managing money. The next week, I emptied out my checking account, which had about $8 in it, and I gave it to the church. Another week came a few days later, and I gave 10%. Another check came a few days later, and I gave 10% of that to the church. Then I got another writing gig with a magazine in Atlanta. And as I deposited that check into my account, I wrote a check to the church. One after another, I started getting called to speak at retreats and conferences that usually pay pretty well, and each time I would write a check to the church. Since then, that conversation with Rick, I have given at least 10% of every dollar I make, just like Kurt, and I have never not had rent. For more than a year, my checking account had hovered or dipped just over or just under zero, and suddenly I had money to spare. I decided I would open a savings account in case someday I would get married and have a family. And with each bit of money that came in, I would give 10% to the church and 10% to the savings account. I was actually budgeting money. I had never done that before. But that is not the best part. The best part is what tithing has done for my relationship with God. Before, I felt like I was always going to God with my fingers crossed, the way a child feels around his father when he knows he has told terrible lies. God knew where I was. He didn't love me any different when I was holding out on him. It's just that I didn't feel clean around him. And you know how that can affect things. I also learned that I needed to give to the poor. My church gives money to the poor, but it is also important for me to give directly to the poor. I would go downtown sometimes and buy a homeless person lunch. I hated it at first because I always stumbled across the guys with terrible table manners. But after a while, I began to like their drunken ramblings. Even though they weren't making any sense, they thought they were, and that has to count for something. Hey, I just bring this story. I know it's a little long, but just to say, hey, don't miss out on the blessings that God gives through learning to trust him. We're not in a place as a church where we are desperate for money. God has just miraculously been providing for us. But I think this is an important thing that I see in so many lives is just the ability to trust God with finance, because it's something that's so central to where our hearts are at. That's what Jesus said. So consider it. Blessings.